Very recently, us as a shop had the opportunity to carry Specialized as a brand, which is new for us. We haven't carried Specialized the entire time we've been a bike shop, but it is a great opportunity. One of the first bikes we got the opportunity to ride was Specialized's newest Epic World Cup. Very interesting looking bike and not similar to almost anything else we really have in the store. The Epic World Cup in itself is a 80 millimeter travel rear, 110 millimeter travel front XC bike. It's what some people will call a soft tail or maybe a full suspension. It does work off of a linkage-based platform, so it is kind of a full suspension, but it's not meant to feel like a full suspension. It's supposed to kind of fill that gap where full suspensions and hardtails used to battle over 5 years ago, but now that full suspension cross-country bikes have gone almost all 120 millimeters of travel, and hardtails have kind of been left in the dust. After hardtails kind of got left behind just a little bit, obviously there's people who still love those, this bike kind of rose to fill that gap, and it's really the only bike like it that we carry. We carry Santa Cruz Scott, BMC, and they don't really make a bike that's very similar to that. Cervelo doesn't either. The Epic World Cup is very special in itself as it's this not-a-hardtail. The bike itself uses a 440 millimeter reach, a 66.5 degree head tube angle, and a 74.5 degree seat tube angle in a size medium, which is the bike that we tested. The rear shock is really the most special part about this build. The rear shock, you can control the negative and positive air chambers separately, so you can get a bike that feels like it's almost completely hardtail, that's barely, where it takes a significant knock to get that rear shock to compress and actually be able to move underneath power, or you can have something that's almost an actual full suspension. You control it separately. They have what they call these gulp modes, where you kind of push down on the bike and you can control the negative chambers separately. And at a full gulp, is what they would call it, it rides more like a full suspension due to the 80 millimeters of rear travels actually compressing. But the way you kind of ride this bike is at 0% sag, which is not super heard of. I mean, in almost all of our bikes we talk about, in terms of cross-country full suspensions, they normally ride between right around the 18 to 25% sag point. I ride my cross-country bikes right around 19, 18% sag personally. Some people ride a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on who you are. But this is supposed to ride at 0% sag. The whole point being is riding it on a flat or putting out power, you're pedaling, it's not supposed to move at all. It's only supposed to move upon impact and not upon pedaling efficiency. So pedaling efficiency is supposed to be through the roof, exactly like a hardtail is, but supposed to take away some of that edge on bigger knocks like a full suspension does, but it's not quite as comfy as a full suspension, doesn't have that small level of compliance that's involved with a full suspension. The linkage platform it runs off of is still a flex stay design similar to like the Santa Cruz Blur, the Cervelo ZFS, Scott Spark, things like that. It still uses one pivot at the bottom, right above the bottom bracket. The rear triangle does not have a pivot on it. Those flex stays are designed to flex, and then the linkage itself is connected one bolt at the shock, one bolt in the rear triangle, and then one center bolt up in the main triangle of the frame. So kind of looks like this, rotates like that as it compresses the rear shock. It's very, very simple design, except this one is tuned to be much more aggressive, so that flex stay is not nearly as flexy for small bump compliance as other bikes we have. Honestly, the kit that we got was awesome, which probably might have been a big part of why I thought this bike was so much fun. I rode the S-Works version, and this one had the Revol one-piece cockpit, a SID Ultimate fork with the brain in it, a SID, I guess it's not technically a SID shock because it was worked with Specialized, but Specialized and RockShox combined rear shock for this bike. It had the Revol Control SL wheels with a 29 millimeter internal rim width, and then also SRAM transmission XXSL drivetrain. Fox transfer dropper post was added on by the person who owns the bike, and they don't actually come with the dropper post, but honestly it made the bike that much more fun. It is the S-Works frame. It was in this gorgeous red color, and it is stupidly light. The test bike that I rode without pedals, but with a power meter, with bottle cages, and with a dropper post weighed in at 20.5 pounds, which is remarkable.
The deadly venom, let me start from the beginning. We always hitting, so yo, there'll be no extra.
This bike felt very, very snappy out of the gate. You're on a double track road, you're on smoother single track, you put the power down and it just shoots you off like a rocket, which is awesome. I mean, it's kind of what you want for that bike. Really where this bike seems like it sits for me and personally in the climbs is it sits as a very, very efficient and fast climber. Smoother climbs, are extremely fast. Let's say you're a kid, you might be doing NICA races. For NICA racing, it's perfect. NICA courses tend to be a little bit smoother, not as technical as full UCI or USAC regulated races. Amazing for that. It was shoots you up and out of nowhere exactly as you need it to. The probably not the best technical climber. I climbed on not as many technical sections I would have liked to reach. It is getting colder here, so a lot of technical sections are under the weather. But in the technical climbing that I did, it felt like when you were going over big bumps or trying to get up rocks or features, as you would go up something like this, it would try to buck you just a little bit on that rock because it's not compressing and holding traction on the rock or feature you're going up. Instead, it's trying to, like a normal full suspension would. Instead, it's kind of going against it. It's bouncing off of it and it acted more like a hardtail in that circumspect. But for the majority of climbs, I mean, it is probably one of the fastest climbing cross-country bikes I've ridden since cross-country bikes have been fully 100 millimeters of travel front and rear, or since the last time I raced a hardtail legitimately, which was over 4 years ago. On flat terrain, this bike was so much fun. I always was catching myself throwing manuals, rolling, going through rollers, pumping as hard as I could to get the most speed out of the bike and riding it pretty aggressively. I rode it as if it was a bike much bigger than its travel numbers indicated, especially on flatter sections, because it was able to handle that really, really easily. It was a little weird. That head tube angle is 66.5 degrees, which is extremely slack for any bike in that range. I mean, it's got 110 millimeters of front travel, but most other bikes in that range, i.e. ones we talked about, Spark, Santa Cruz Blur, Cervelo ZFS, most of those come in a 120 mil or 100 mil platform. But in their 120 mil platforms, they're usually between 66.6 to 67.5 degree head angle. So this bike is actually slacker than all of the rest of them, which was weird. On fire roads, it was awesome. You could get out of the saddle and you could sprint and it would get up and go like a racehorse, which was really, really awesome. But I guess kind of intended as that's what this bike is almost exactly made for. This bike really, really excelled in being the exact thing that was missing out as soon as most people, including me, including myself, started doing when we went to a full 120 millimeter travel bike. Is when you go to a full 120 millimeter travel bike, you end up losing a little bit of that climbing capability and that super long snap and that super snappiness you got on the older style cross country bikes that most of us haven't had for around 3 or 4 years. But hardtails seem too harsh for modern day USAC or UCI courses, and this feels that little niche. I think this bike would excel, especially on like some of the events in the Lifetime Grand Prix, like the like Leadville, for reference, is like this is the perfect Leadville bike for bigger hits, like such down power line where you might want to get not as quite as sketched out. The Epic World Cup would do those perfectly, but for most of the time, it's still a hardtail. So those like kind of more non-technical races like Leadville, the Epic World Cup is probably the perfect bike. It probably would have been my number one choice. I also earlier this year had the chance to ride White Rim Trail down in Moab, and I loved doing that. And I did that on a Santa Cruz Blur, but however, the Epic World Cup would have also been a fantastic choice for that trail. White Rim Trail is mainly Jeep road, but it's long. There are the occasional big hits, though they are rare, and it is very, very fatiguing. And the Epic World Cup, I think, would have done perfect in that because because it would have helped with some of those big hits that require full suspension to do fast times on the White Rim, but get rid of a lot of the downside considering how much of it is smoother climbs, double track, and Jeep road. Honestly, in comparison to some other cross-country bikes, it kind of falls in this weird place where we can't really compare it to anything else we have in the store. If you were to compare it to, say, let's say like a Scott Spark or an Orbea Oise, some of our top-end bikes, it is most similar to the Orbea Oise, and even then it's still extremely different. The Orbea Oise we have is a 67-degree head tube angle. It is 120 millimeters of travel front and rear, and it's meant to be an all-out race bike, which is the reason why the Epic is the most similar to it. And the Epic World Cup is the most similar to the Oise in terms of the bikes we carry, because the Oise in itself also feels like it wants to get up and go, race super hard, be a great short track racing bike. The Oise and the Epic share those likelihoods in that, but the Oise still is more, like I say, technically adept in steeper descents. It doesn't get sketched out in steeper descents. The argument 4 years ago when I was racing used to be, oh, for this race, do you want to race a hardtail or do you want to race a 100 millimeter full suspension? And now the decision is going to be, do you want to race your 120 millimeter full suspension or the Epic World Cup, which is that 180, 110 front? It's very much for somebody who's doing a lot of smoother tracks. So maybe you're a NICA racer, maybe you're doing like a mixture of smoother gravel races and mountain bike races, or maybe you're somebody who where your certain terrain or the area around you is fairly smooth. Let's say the terrain around you isn't very technical and you feel like your full suspension most of the time does feel too heavy for what you're doing, and you tend to end up riding a hardtail, but sometimes you want that little bit of squish instead of that knock sensation. Let's say you're going off a drop or you're hitting a big jump and you land that, but most of the time the hardtail's fine. This could be for you as well. It helps with those really big knocks, but most of the time it still feels like a hardtail. Honestly, very unusual bike. I was a huge fan of it, and I would highly recommend it for anybody with those smoother terrains. If you want to see one for yourself, feel free to stop by here in store at our Salt Lake City location or in Park City, or feel free to call us in. You can also visit our website at contenderbicycles.com. If you have any more questions, you can chat us there.
The beauty of a flower plus dimensions like a prism. Your minds are locked down like prison. Y'all really need to go lay down.